Hello everyone, and welcome to our fall regional meeting and our discussion of tax credit reform. And here with us to discuss that issue is Brian Schmidt, and Brian is a political analyst, and he is the founder of Missouri Wonk, which is a public policy analysis consulting firm, and Brian's done a lot of research on this issue of tax credits. Melissa Randall is MSBA's Deputy Executive Director and also a member of the state's Tax Credit Review Commission. And Mike Reed is our Associate Executive Director for Advocacy and our Chief Lobbyist in Jeff City. And we thank all of you for being with us. And Brian, let's start with you if we could and get a little background on this issue. What exactly are tax credits?
Tax credits are dollar-for-dollar reductions in taxes that are owed to Missouri. So, for instance, if you owed $100 to Missouri in the form of income taxes, you could take a tax credit worth $100 and satisfy that tax liability.
And so this is what it really represents to the state is a loss of revenue that otherwise would come into the state. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And why, Brian, have tax credits become such a large part of the state budget?
They've really grown over the past 2 decades. In the 1990s, they created a lot of different tax credit programs. And then the cost of those programs really didn't start hitting the budget until the 2000s. And so they've started to eat up a greater portion of the state's budget.
About how much of the state's budget are we talking about now?
Talking about between $500 and $600 million usually, annually, which
And
represents anywhere from, it's usually about 7.5% to 8.5% right now.
And this is really state spending, isn't it? I mean, some people might not think of it that way, but it is spending.
That's right. Yeah, it's instead they could take that dollar that currently goes to tax credits and they could spend it on other priorities such as education.
And Brian, we're seeing this significant growth in tax credit expenditures at the same time that we've seen the state revenue picture struggle in recent years. Isn't that the case?
That's right. If you look at this chart right here, this has, we have a Hancock Amendment which provides that taxpayers get refunds if we go above a certain limit. But if you look at this chart here, that blue line represents the total amount of total state revenues that are collected. As you can see, back in 2009, it started to take a serious dip, and it bottomed out in 2010. And only recently is it starting to grow again as the economy recovers. But as you look at this chart over here, tax credits continue to eat up a larger and larger chunk of the overall budget. So they've increased from 1999 2.3%. They've made up about 2.3% of our total budget, and now in 2012 they're at 8.6%. So this is especially important because the education formula, the formula that funds all the school districts in the state, right now they're underfunded by more than $300 million. And so as you can see, tax credits are growing, the funding of the formula is decreasing, overall revenues are decreasing for the state, and it really begs the question, where does Missouri's priorities lie?
What are some examples of tax credit programs?
This chart right here has some examples. So for instance, that they have different purposes. So the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, its purpose is to provide affordable housing to individuals and families in Missouri. You also have tax credits that are designed to help attract businesses to the state, such as quality jobs. You also have tax credits that try to achieve some social purpose. Usually there's donations to nonprofits involved, such as the Neighborhood Assistance Program tax credit. And then you also have programs that are designed to help distressed areas. So for instance, the Distressed Areas Land Assemblage Tax Credit Program.
But there are really two that we tend to focus on that really take up the bulk of tax credits. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so for instance, there's 2 tax credits that usually makes up about 45% of all the tax credits that are out there. So out of the 61 programs that Missouri has, there's 2 of them that eat up almost half of the tax credits that get redeemed each year. And those programs are the Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program, which is an incentive to rehabilitate historic buildings. Usually they're located in downtowns of cities. And there's a federal tax credit, and the state designed a tax credit program that is extremely similar to the federal tax credit program. It's worth 25% of eligible qualified rehabilitation expenditures. And over the past few years, the tax credit authorizations under the program have ranged between $82 and $212 million each year. Usually the redemptions have usually been somewhere between $83 million and $170 million.
Mm-hmm. And on the historic preservation tax credit, Brian, we're up there among the leaders in the country and actually dole out a lot more of those than many states, even on the East Coast, don't we?
That's correct. Yeah, it's the program has really grown since the early 2000s, and it's consistently ranked either number 1 or number 2 throughout the nation.
Mm-hmm. And the low-income tax credit, Brian, I mean, that sounds like a good idea. Are there problems with that one that you see?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the efficiency of the tax credit. For instance, it's streamed out over 10 years, and the cost associated with streaming out that program over 10 years really hurts the efficiency of the tax credit program. Mm-hmm. The developers of this low-income housing buildings, they'll get a tax credit equal to 9% of eligible expenditures each year for a 10-year period, or 4% of the eligible expenditures each year for a 10-year period. And this is also a program that has a federal program as well. So the project could get the same amount in state credits as it does federal credits.
And these tax credits also, Brian, a lot of people may not realize, but they are really entitlements, aren't they? I mean, when people qualify for them, they get them.
Yeah,
is that right?
The historic preservation tax credit is an entitlement. As long as you meet the demands of the program, then you're going to get a tax credit, mm-hmm. basically.
Mm-hmm. And talk about legislative oversight a little bit of tax credits. Is there much?
Well, each year the state budget, or the budget committees in the House and the Senate, they're required to annually review tax credit programs. And so what happens is each department that administers a tax credit program comes before the General Assembly and basically describes what each program is. And then each budget committee is responsible for approving the estimates contained in a document. It's called the Form 14.
Mm-hmm. But the tax credits really don't go through the appropriations process.
They do not go through the appropriations process.
Right.
That's correct.
Right. Has there been legislation introduced in recent years about tax credits that might get at some tax credit reform?
Yeah. In 2009, there was the most recent successful bill that came that actually passed the General Assembly and was approved by the governor. And this did cap the historic preservation tax credit at $140 million each year. It created an exemption for small projects, which receive $275,000 or less in tax credits. They also made some changes to some other tax credit programs, like the low-income housing tax credit program, by placing a cap of $60 million in authorizations annually. But they're still really big programs, especially nationwide.
Mm-hmm. So the bottom line for us, Brian, as far as education is concerned, is that this does represent a significant expenditure by the state and really, in effect, crowds out spending that otherwise might take place, say, on K-12 education or other state-supported services. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yeah. It continues to eat up more and more of the state's resources. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but there's also, aside from the tax credits that have been redeemed already, there's still an outstanding liability of more than $2 billion that could be redeemed over the next 15 years. And
so if those were redeemed all at once, or a large portion of them, it really could put a significant strain on the state budget.
Most of them will be redeemed. They're front-loaded, which means that they'll probably be redeemed over the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. So we've already promised out a significant amount of tax credits for the future that we really can't do anything about that. Mm-hmm.
Melissa Randall, you are a member of the State Tax Credit Review Commission that was appointed by the governor, and that commission was formed a couple of years ago, has issued a report. Tell us about that group's work.
Well, that group is made up of 27 individuals from across the state of Missouri. It's a nonpartisan group made up of business leaders, education leaders, individuals representing just about every segment of our economy. And our purpose originally was to review all 61 programs that are tax credit programs on the books and look at their efficiencies, determine if there are ways we could improve their efficiencies, and if we need to make changes such as elimination of those programs. That was part of our task, to recommend elimination of those that just don't make sense in Missouri any longer. And we did that in 2010.
And so what are your major recommendations overall?
Well, we did recommend that we eliminate, I believe it was about 28 programs, and we also recommended efficiencies for the remaining programs. Things such as sunset clauses, as Brian mentioned. Many of our programs on the books right now never have to be officially reviewed by the legislature. Without a sunset clause, they're on the books permanently. And so we thought that it was important to have sunset clauses for these programs that are drawing down such a large amount of our general revenue. Other things that we thought were important are clawback provisions. If a program is not meeting the terms that are set forth in statute, if an individual is receiving a tax credit, we ought to be able to get some of that money returned to the state of Missouri. So we felt like those are important provisions to include.
Mm-hmm. Now, Melissa, those seem like some very reasonable ideas to put some limits on tax credits, but really, to this point, those ideas haven't gone very far. Why is that?
Well, it's probably a question for Mike, but we've had some resistance in one chamber in particular, in the General Assembly. I think that we had a bill during special session a couple of years ago that had some momentum, had some potential, that included a number of our recommendations, but again, politics was able to get in the way and kill that piece of legislation. And that is why the governor has reconvened our commission and asked us to look again at our 2010 recommendations and see if we need to make any changes, fine-tune anything, and once again try to take these recommendations to the General Assembly and work in partnership and make some real common sense reform. I should point out that MSBA is not anti-tax credit. We are not recommending that all tax credits are eliminated. We think some have real significant value for economic development. We just think there needs to be common sense reform.
You mentioned, Melissa, the Tax Credit Review Commission reconvening, so are you going to be meeting here over the next few weeks? Is that the idea?
We are. We've met once in Jefferson City, and we have been asked, of the 27 members, we're split up into 10 committees to give us an opportunity to really drill down deep on the 61 original tax credit programs we were tasked to look at. That structure still in place, and the 10 committees have been asked again to look at our reports from 2010, see if we need to fine-tune those, and we have a deadline of December 5th. We have to have all of our recommendations back on the governor's desk by December 5th.
Mm-hmm. Mike Reed, let's delve into the politics of this a little bit if we could. You work in Jefferson City every day at the Capitol, and there has been, as we mentioned earlier, some legislation on tax credits. We've had the Tax Credit Review Commission with their recommendations, and yet this issue seems to be stalled in the General Assembly. Why is that?
It is stalled in the General Assembly, and it's stalled because there are some individuals in the state of Missouri who receive a tremendous amount of money through tax credits and use these tax credits for various things. Low-income housing development, this is a very, very lucrative place for someone to receive tax credits, and there are a small number, and Brian can give you that number, but there are about 9 big players in that, I think, in the state of Missouri, and they have a lot of influence in the General Assembly. That's one of the reasons that we're bringing this to our fall regional meetings, to get our members to discuss this and to talk about the fact that how does this affect various school districts in the state of Missouri. It actually affects every school district in the state of Missouri, and the reason is because there's a big lobbying effort to keep these tax credits going by a small group of individuals.
Is there a difference between the House and the Senate on the politics of this, Mike?
Yes, there is. I'm trying to figure out the best way to be diplomatic about this. The House has a more dug-in situation. The Senate last year was very open to some discussion on tax credits, and the Senate again will be very open this year. There are some proponents in the Senate and some champions in the Senate who will want to work on changing tax credits. The House is much more solid about keeping it sort of the way that it is. But it's extremely important because, as Brian has said, this money comes right off the top of the budget. It is money that, in essence, if I say it is appropriated on the top, it is not appropriated. It does not go through appropriations process, but it comes off the top of the budget. And so therefore, things like the foundation formula, which is underfunded again, is reduced because the total pot is reduced.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so presumably, if we had some reasonable limits on tax credits, that would free up some revenue, and K-12 education potentially would benefit from that.
Well, I think everybody in the state of Missouri would benefit from it, but that is completely correct. If we looked at this, everyone could benefit from that because the pot gets bigger.
Brian, correct me if I'm wrong here, but in FY12, this last fiscal year, it was our 4th largest expenditure in the state of Missouri, tax credits. The only areas we spent more on was the K-12 education, higher education, and social services, Medicaid.
Mm-hmm. And that's something, Melissa, the public is really not aware of this, that's such a large part of the state budget. Isn't that true?
I think that's accurate. And to me, those numbers are staggering. When you're spending more on tax credits than you are corrections, mental health, and you go through the list of priorities that we have as a state, and most of these expenditures are occurring without real scrutiny. Without going through the appropriations process or without having a sunset clause where we have an opportunity to debate their merits on a regular basis, that's frightening.
Mm-hmm. Mike, what's the outlook for legislation for the coming session in 2013?
Well, right now the crystal ball is a little cloudy, but I would have to say that what we're going to be looking at is bills to look at tax credits to see if in fact they are doing what they are supposed to do. Perhaps bills looking at capping the amount of money that can go into any tax credits, and also making sure that each tax credit is reviewed every X number of years, so there's a sunset clause with each one. Those are all the situations that I see will get some debate. There will be a discussion on whether or not to appropriate the tax credits to go through the appropriations process. That will be a very heated debate. But I think the chances of that passing are not as good as at least the idea of capping tax credits, as well as the idea of putting a sunset clause on each tax credit so they are reviewed. But it is something that started out, and it's an interesting concept, but it has grown exponentially, really, over the number of years, and the ability of tax credits to take tax credits and stack them, and maybe Brian can talk more about that, but that is the ability to take several types of tax credits and double and triple the value.
How does that work, Brian?
That's right. If you have if you had a building that was located in a downtown area, like downtown St. Louis, for instance, it was a historic building, you could get tax credits under the Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program, the state program. You can get tax credits under the federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. And then if you also rented out those units to low-income individuals and got low-income housing tax credits, you can get tax credits under the state low-income housing tax credit program and the federal low-income housing tax credit program. So in the end, you could end up with more tax credits than what the entire project cost. And that's happened several times throughout the history of both programs.
So you can see where this could be very lucrative for some individuals involved in some of these projects if they're able to do that.
That's correct.
Right. Yeah.
Hence the resistance to change all those programs.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, what should our members be doing? Our school board members and superintendents right now talking to legislators, I presume, before the session, and what should they say?
They should. Well, after this presentation and we go into the discussion group, they should be discussing among themselves, how do these tax credits affect their district? And to say, well, I live in so-and-so, and I don't see any of these tax credits here in our community. We don't have any low-income housing or not much in the way of historic tax credits. It affects every community because it comes right off the top of the general revenue and the general budget of the state of Missouri. So the formula is underfunded because of this reason. So it affects every student in the state of Missouri. So what they should be doing is talking about these tax credits, talking about how some of them are good and how they're bad, and how that it may affect their community in one way or the other. And then they need to be discussing this with their members of the General Assembly, their House members and their Senate members, and to take this information to them and show them that it's coming right off the top of the state money. And so it really is the fourth largest appropriation that we have. And so tax credits are more important than corrections or Department of Public Safety, Department of Revenue, economic development. That's an interesting question, and that's a question that we need to discuss on is that the appropriate place for it? Is this the appropriate place for government to be doing this situation? And if it is, where and how?
The interesting thing about tax credits is that they don't compete with other priorities in the state budget. So tax credits come first. In a way, they're safer than state bonds because if you have a tax credit, you're allowed to cash that in before the state makes any appropriations to meet its other priorities. And so the lack of competition is one of the major reasons why they should be reviewed and why they should have sunsets and caps.
Mike, do you think that some legislators themselves are not aware of the impact tax credits have on the budget?
I think there are so many items hitting them at all times that they probably are not as aware of as they should be about how much this is draining from the coffers of the state of Missouri. Yes, I really believe that it is something that we need to educate our elected officials on.
And Melissa, it's not just MSBA that's making this a top priority, but the education community as a whole is doing that also, right?
That's right, Brent. The Education Roundtable this summer discussed the topic of tax credits and decided that as a whole, all members of the Education Roundtable, we would collectively work on tax credit reform this coming session. And those members include the superintendent's organization, the 2 principals organizations, the 3 teachers organizations, and PTA, along with MSBA. We'll be making this our priority for the coming session.
All right. Brian Schmidt, Melissa Randall, Mike Reed, thanks a lot for being with us and sharing information on this critical issue of tax credit reform.
Thank you.
Thank you.